Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Probably Cancelled podcast in association with the Midwestern Marx Institute. My name is Bridget, and I'm your host. And today I am here with Inemesit Richardson of the Thomas Sankara Center in Burkina Faso's capital of Ouagadougou. And the Thomas Sankara Center is a library and community education center that is doing amazing work both locally and internationally. And I'm so happy to have Inemesit here today to talk about the story of the Land of the Upright Men of Burkina Faso and the emergence of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who is continuing the legacy of the revolutionary great Thomas Sankara, who's one of my favorite people of all time. So I'm super happy to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm really good. I'm very happy to be on. I'm excited to talk to anybody interested in the revolution happening in the Sahel and the Pan-African struggle being waged worldwide in defense of the Alliance of Sahel states right now.
Yeah, it's super amazing. I wanted to invite you on because not many Westerners know anything about Africa at all, and know nothing about the history of anti-imperialist struggle within Africa. But with the emergence of Captain Ibrahim Traoré and him being in the news and doing so many amazing things for his people, a lot more Westerners are starting to find out what has been happening for decades in the region. So having a little educational seminar is always ideal so that people can have one place to go to learn a lot more about the history. So just to start out, how did the transformation from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso under Thomas Sankara occur? And can you speak a little bit about the legacy of Thomas Sankara for those who are not familiar?
Okay, so Thomas Sankara came to power in 1983. Sometimes he's confused as being sort of the father of independence of the country, now known as Burkina Faso, which isn't technically correct, but it is true in a certain way, in the sense that the country that existed prior to Thomas Sankara coming to power, Upper Volta, I would argue is a fundamentally different country from Burkina Faso, which preceded it. So in a way, even though he wasn't the leader that took independence or seized independence from the French, he was the leader who gave birth to the country that is now known as Burkina Faso. Um, Thomas Sankara was a revolutionary pan-Africanist scientific socialist leader who transformed the country in a 4-year period of time. He only had 4 years before he was assassinated by his right-hand man, Blaise Compaoré, but I think it's very important that we underscore that the CIA played a role in his assassination, as did France, and that there are still documents that need to be declassified to better understand how those Western countries worked to destabilize the Burkina Faso revolution of the 1980s. But to give an overview of what happened during that 4-year period, it's hard to summarize because there are just so many changes. I mean, there were mass campaigns across the country. The basic fundamental unit of the revolution in Burkina Faso was called the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, the CDRs, inspired by Cuba's Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, the same name. And they functioned somewhat similarly. They served as the eyes and ears of the revolution, but they also carried out popular campaigns to transform society, to transform people's material conditions. So there were campaigns around public health. There was a vaccination campaign where the span of a few weeks, a million children were vaccinated from various diseases, yellow fever, measles, meningitis. There was a massive literacy campaign. There was massive infrastructure building. There was a famous project to build a railway line between Ouagadougou and this a town slash city or small city called Kaya. There was a massive emphasis on food sovereignty. One of the things that Thomas Sankara was most famous for was proclaiming that we need to produce what we consume and consume what we produce. So this major emphasis on sovereignty, but especially when it came to the food system. Another quote by him is, where is imperialism? Look at your plate. So really focused on, who controls, what we're eating on a day-to-day basis. There was an emphasis really on local production across the board. That includes, for example, producing locally made fabrics. There's a fabric called the Faso Fani, which is made out of cotton. Burkina Faso is one of Africa's leading cotton producers. And during Thomas Sankara's era, there was a major emphasis on cotton for local production and local use. Unfortunately, after the Sankara era, we see Burkina Faso as a country that's one of the major cotton exporters, but also importing cotton from countries like France. So that's kind of like, we can see sort of the contrast and how, to what was Sankara was pushing and what, happens under neocolonialism typically. There was a massive call for, and also cultural decolonization of the African continent. That was something happening in contingent to a global Pan-African struggle that connected to the diaspora as well. Thomas Sankara famously visited Harlem and stated that our White House is in Black Harlem, and invited the Africans of the diaspora to come to Burkina Faso for the annual Pan-African Film Festival, which was a cultural it's a cultural event that happens every 2 years, but it was something of a renaissance when Sankara was in power. He promoted the use of local languages, in just to give context around that and what this means in the context of the Sahel, because I think sometimes people see sort of cultural struggles as being delinked from material struggles, whereas they really go hand in hand. And so in the Sahel, for example, what we have up until very recently, and maybe we'll get into it, is a context where the official language is French, but the vast majority of the population doesn't speak French, cannot communicate in French. And unfortunately, it's meant that a lot of the population has not had access to schooling or education, or a pathway to literacy. So historically, during the Thomas Sankara era, there was a major effort to within the literacy campaign, teach people to read and write in their local languages, like More, Jola, Fulfude. These are the local African languages that are spoken here. That's a huge contrast to what's typical, which is, and this is something that the current states are working on, but to some extent, even to this day, just changing kind of right now. If somebody wants to learn to read and write, they have to learn to speak a second language that they don't know, and then learn how to, read and write from that point. So this would be like maybe for a U.S. audience, like being told that in order to go to school, you need to learn how to speak Japanese first, and then you can learn how to enter a classroom. That's basically how things have been. So there is a major emphasis on a cultural decolonization, but also linked to certain basic sort of material needs in order for a country to be able to develop. I could go on. There's so much that happened in that 4-year period. So much is connected to the Cuban Revolution. I mean, that could be an entire episode in and of itself. But that's a very strong sort of international and Pan-African link between those two revolutions. But yeah, it's really something that has defined Burkina Faso to this day. And just as a final note, I'll say, Burkina Faso, so Upper Volta was a term that the French imposed onto the region that they colonized. So that's the former name of the country. And the origin of Upper Volta comes from Portuguese, because the Portuguese were the first colonizers in West Africa. So Volta is a Portuguese word in origin. It hasn't had no meaning for the people who live in Burkina Faso, and most people don't even know what the Volta River is, because we have local words for the sort of the terms that the Portuguese and the French used. Burkina Faso, on the other hand, is a declaration of revolutionary principles. It means the land of upright people. And so I think there's something really unique in the sense that every single time somebody refers to themselves as a Burkinabe, which means basically a person of integrity, they're actually directly referencing a set of revolutionary principles.
And I know you mentioned before the influences that Cuba has had on Burkina Faso, but I was wondering if there are other key influences for Sankara and his revolutionary agenda, and how did they challenge both colonial legacies and global capitalist systems within Africa? I'm sure there are more influences than just Cuba, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. Thomas Sankara came from sort of a legacy and a tradition of Pan-African and Global South resistance. So, he had the strongest and most direct influence probably was Cuba, which is why Burkina Faso and Cuba share a slogan, La patrie le mort nous vaincrons, the homeland or death we will succeed. It comes from a direct quote from Fidel Castro. But he was also inspired by other revolutionaries across the Americas, across Africa, and across the world in general. So he had very strong relationships with the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. He went to visit Nicaragua and met with President Daniel Ortega in the 80s. And denounced, the Contras and was very vocal about that. He had a relationship with Maurice Bishop in Grenada, and he spoke about how he met with Maurice Bishop and how he was writing a letter to deliver to Maurice Bishop right before Bishop was assassinated. So he never actually received Sankara's letter, but that was another inspiration that Sankara cited. And then, across the African continent, Sankara famously stated that he was inspired by certain Pan-African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba. He had a very close relationship with Samora Machel in Mozambique. And so, he spent time there. He visited there. Outside of that, he had close ties with North Korea as well. There is speculation, and I'm not necessarily certain that I have a official source to confirm it, other than what I've been told by people. But there's speculation that a North Korean, revolutionary artist composed Burkina Faso's national anthem. So the lyrics were written by Thomas Sankara, but I've been told that it was actually a North Korean who composed the song. And so there's a certain history also between those two countries. That's there. Sankara visited the Soviet Union. So, he was an internationalist. He had this sort of outlook of global revolution, but also very much grounded in a Pan-African tradition as well, an anti-imperialist tradition. Revolutionary socialist tradition. So there's a lot of influences that shaped Burkina Faso's, what he called the popular and democratic revolution. So that's the 1983 to 1987 period.
Okay, and then he was brutally assassinated in 1987. What happened to Burkina Faso after the death of Thomas Sankara?
The death of Thomas Sankara was a huge tragedy and setback for the progress of the country. For 27 years, Burkina Faso was ruled over by a man named Blaise Compaoré, who played perhaps the most direct and immediate role in Sankara's assassination. I sometimes argue that people focus a little bit too much on him, in the sense that we can never neglect that there was an international conspiracy involved in taking Sankara out. So I always want to emphasize that. But in terms of who was the most sort of direct figure involved in an assassination on the ground, it would be Blaise Compaoré. And he controlled the country for, like I said, 27 years, reversing a lot of the gains of the revolution of the time. There was a network of pretty much corruption and bribery that was developed that became known as the Compaoré network, that in many ways really, really hurt and crushed the Burkina Faso's left at the time. So a lot of revolutionary organizations were pushed underground, and then others were kind of just corrupted or bought off in some ways by the Compaoré government. It's all of the progress pretty much was halted. So, we don't really hear about food sovereignty as a goal during this time. This is the era, like I said, where Burkina Faso is selling cotton overseas, but also you go to pharmacies and you buy cotton, from France. Just an economy that just doesn't make sense and has nothing to do with the needs of the people. Just a total French imperialist neo-colonial domination, also a very, very reactionary foreign policy tied to violent, Western-backed imperialist sort of warmongering in places like Liberia, So there's ties to Charles Taylor, who's a Liberian warlord that was an ally of Blaise Compaoré. Jonas Savimbi, a reactionary leader from Angola who has ties to the Compaoré administration. So just total reverse from Sankara's revolutionary government, even on a world scale, this international, these sort of international relations. So yeah, it was a terrible period of time. It's an interesting period of time from a Burkinabe perspective. There's a certain contradiction in terms of like both repression. It was very hard to talk about Sankara. Like there was a danger in uttering Sankara's name publicly on the one hand, but on the other hand, there was a lot of resistance nevertheless. I think, for me, the most outstanding resistance that I think ought to be better known is the way teachers and students organized annually a strike. This is something that was, primary schools, secondary schools. That would be the equivalent of like elementary, middle, high school. You know, Students would take time every year to go on strike alongside their teachers. And the big cry was justice for Thomas Sankara. And I should also mention there were a number of very high profile political assassinations that happened during the Blaise Compaoré era. One of the most notable was the death of the journalist Norbert Zongo, who was working to expose a lot of Blaise Compaoré's corruption. He's become kind of also considered like a martyr and also a revolutionary figure in Burkina Faso, because he really put his life on the line to expose just the corruption of the era. And he was killed for his reporting. And so he is just one case of a few of just notable sort of political assassinations during that time period. So both kind of a crushing of the left in a way, but also other forms of resistance on a mass level happening, not just the schools, but I think that's just one of the best examples of where people were still pushing back.
Wow. Yeah. Oh my gosh. The history is really amazing, and in the past few years, we've seen the emergence of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. And in what ways has Traoré's leadership been compared or contrasted to Sankara? Or can you just tell us a little bit about Traoré and how is he being received by the Burkinabe people?
Yeah, there's so much to go into here. To touch, it's hard to know where to begin, but to touch on your first point, there's a lot of similarities between how President Ibrahim Traoré came to power and how Thomas Sankara came to power. There's a lot of interesting parallels. They both came to power. They were soldiers. These are both people who came through the military and came to power through coups, which has been controversial, I guess, particularly outside of Burkina Faso, for people who don't really understand some of the country's historical context and then some of the relationship between the military and civil society, which is, I think, very unique in the context of Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso has had very many coups. I can't remember off the top of my head how many, but more coups than like electoral transfers to power. And so some of the most revolutionary and reactionary figures have come to power in Burkina Faso through coups. So people are very familiar with what some people have labeled military rule. I think it's kind of, it has a negative connotation. But I just want to make the point that people are familiar with, both the absolute best and the absolute worst that it has to offer. And so I think people in Burkina Faso have really the capacity to judge and analyze like what direction sometimes these coups are headed in pretty early on because of that specific sort of historical context. Sankara and Traoré are very similar. They were both very young when they came to power. President Ibrahim Traoré is the world's youngest head of state, youngest president. He's 36 right now. When he came to power, I guess he was 34. I hope I'm not getting it wrong, but it's been like 2 years now. So, or this was 2022. So I still think he was like 34 when he came to power, and he's 36 now, if I'm not messing up here. And then Sankara, when he came to power, if I'm correct, I think he was 36. So they both are coming to power kind of in their mid 30s ish, which is very, very young compared to, first of all, on an international level, most heads of states are much older in general. I mean, if you look at the United States right now, the United States has had leaders for the most part in their 70s, but also if you look in Africa, the leaders tend to be way older. They both come from the military. They both kind of have, it's an interesting thing. There's like kind of a coup that precedes them, and then like a counter coup that brings them to power. So Thomas Sankara was involved in a coup before he came to power. And then he quickly realized that it wasn't headed in a revolutionary direction, and that he had to do things for himself, and then he took power, which is what happened with Traoré. There was a coup that preceded him. It was very quickly realized that this coup was not headed in the right direction, and Traoré came and took over. So there's a lot of similarities in just kind of the way the process happened. And Thomas Sankara always argued that it wasn't just a coup, it was a popular and democratic revolution, because the people came to the streets, they mobilized, and they really fought for him to come to power, because he was a political prisoner under Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo, who preceded him. And similarly, Ibrahim Traoré really is the result of popular mobilizations, if not organizing happening in the leading up to his coming to power. So there's like this mass involvement in terms of pouring out into the streets, these organized campaigns and mobilizations, basically calling for sort of the revolutionary direction that these leaders are going to take. And I'll also say Traoré came to power very much inspired by what was going on in Mali. So it has to be understood that there was a context outside of Burkina Faso that preceded this. So in 2021, there was a coup in Mali that led to President Assimi Goïta taking power. There's a very interesting sort of, context here. For many years, and I personally perceive this more around 2018, 2019, like when this starts to really accelerate, but there begins to be like a popular movement built upon mass frustration with French neocolonialism. And at first, a lot of it was targeting something called the CFA franc, which is a currency system, a monetary system that 14 African countries are subjected to, where they basically use a currency that is printed in France, but it requires them to hold 50% of their national reserves in the French treasury in Paris, and gives France voting and veto power in the regional banks of Central and West Africa. And basically, France determines how much the currency is worth relative to the euro, which it's anchored upon. There's a whole history, but basically just to say that like no economic decisions can really be made long term in West and Central African countries that use this currency without France's approval. There's an interesting book about this called, the English title I think is Africa's Last Colonial Currency, A History of the CFA franc, by Ndongo Samba Sylla and Fanny Pigeot. So if you're interested in that history, look it up. But in 2018, there started to be like mass protests across the region against this currency. In Mali, that became coupled with a protest against French military occupation. So the French had the majority of their military forces concentrated in Mali for this sort of operation. It's called Operation Barkhane, which was all across the Sahel, but really like Mali was like the main base, the headquarters of basically this like French military occupation. Assimi Goïta put an end to this, and in 2022, Mali gave a very powerful speech at the United Nations stating that while France was claiming to fight against terrorism, to be part of this war against terrorism in Africa, Mali's government basically said that France was arming terrorist organizations and providing them with intelligence, providing these terrorist organizations with intelligence, information, basically helping the side that they claimed to be combating. And this was like a whoa moment for Burkina Faso next door, you know, because it's this, these three countries share a lot historically.
Hmm.
It's so much context here, but basically, you know, before they were colonized, these are like the same people. A lot of people in Burkina Faso have family in Mali. They speak the same language. Oh, can you hear me? Okay. They speak the same language, you know, on both sides. There's kind of this, there's a strong sort of feeling of them being sort of like one people that were divided um, through French colonial sort of balkanization. So there's a strong sort of
Hmm.
already like shared identity across the region. And to hear like Mali taking this bold move, it really started a lot of like conversation in Burkina Faso. There was like a period of kind of obsession with what's happening next door in Mali. And Mali started to collaborate with Russia militarily, really kind of as a way to de-link from France, and sort of de-link from the NATO sort of camp as a whole, and to find an alternative partner. And so there's this huge push for what the people are calling multipolarity, and that becomes really like the word of the day in Mali and then Burkina Faso. And so the coup happens in Burkina, and then, you know, I'm saying a lot, but just long story short, you know, Traoré comes to power, and I'm sure we can talk a lot about some of the transformations that happened then. Um, about, you know, a little over a year after Traoré comes to power, Niger also has a coup, and this is also something that was very, very long anticipated. So once Burkina Faso and Mali both had coups that turned against the West, and both ended French military occupation in both countries, expelled their previous French ambassadors, and began to talk about unifying this sort of Pan-African way. After this happens, like all eyes basically were on Niger. So there were a lot of like false flags, like alerts for like a Niger coup before it actually happened. So I would see, for example, like scrolling on social media, like Niger coup, but it was, you know, made up. It was like speculation until it actually happened. So a lot of people were just kind of like holding their breath, looking to see, you know, would Niger join? And then, you know, July 26th, 2023, Niger has a coup, and things are very quick. In Niger, they expelled the French military immediately. They actually closed the French embassy. You know, I mean, it was like in a period of like a few weeks, it was like the country was totally rejecting the neo-colonial trajectory that it had been on up until that point in time. And then Niger also became the very first African country in history to end cooperation with U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM. So there's actually only one country in Africa that totally refused to collaborate with AFRICOM. That's Eritrea. Eritrea has never signed an agreement with AFRICOM. Egypt technically doesn't, because Egypt is under another U.S. command, but they still collaborate militarily with the United States. It's just they call it CENTCOM. But anyways, just to say, Niger became the very, very first African country to have previously had an accord, a military accord with AFRICOM, and to have completely outlawed it, said, you know, collaboration with the United States militarily is illegal. And so the three countries collaborate very closely together and are actually working to unify into a Pan-African federation. So they're right now a confederation called the Alliance of Sahel States. And then the long-term goal is to federate into a Pan-African state that will ultimately eliminate the colonial borders that were imposed upon the three countries.
That's so exciting. I'm so excited because if I correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I'm aware, in the time of Thomas Sankara, Mali's government was an antagonistic force towards Burkina Faso. So for this complete chain of events to occur, to allow these revolutions essentially to happen, and then for these countries to unite in the way that so many people have wished for so long, and then the working with Russia just strengthens their power so much more than what Burkina Faso had in the time of Thomas Sankara. Am I right about the Mali thing?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You know, I think one of the reasons why Burkina Faso struggled so much in the 1980s was because it was really isolated politically in the region.
Mhm.
There just were not a lot of Pan-African or revolutionary governments. And, you know, the argument of the Pan-African struggle has always been that Africa needs to be able to unify in order to be strong and in order to be a force that's capable of defending itself. And this is a historical struggle. So Mali has a very interesting socialist history in the 1960s that a lot of English speakers don't know about. There was a revolutionary socialist leader named Modibo Keita. I highly encourage people to look into him. But by the time the 1980s rolled around, that had been completely overthrown, and there was actually outward conflict, even to the point of there being a brief period of war between Burkina Faso and Mali. Thomas Sankara participated in it, and he later said that he regretted it because he just didn't feel like basically that the two countries should be fighting each other. But that does show to the level of antagonism. So I think there's a strong argument to be made that when these African countries are trying to forge their paths of sovereignty on their own, they're just weak, and there really does have to be this push for unity. And Sankara said it. He said it at the conference against debt in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. He made a declaration that if if Burkina Faso, or I as a leader of Burkina Faso, say that we're not going to be paying back the neo-colonial debt, if we proclaim this on our own, I won't be here at the next conference to talk to you. Astute observation, all things considered. But if we all have sort of this united front, that's something that becomes impenetrable. So, I think that context of unity that's happening right now is really, really essential. And there's a long, long, long history to go into in terms of intergenerational sort of struggle in the region towards that objective of having a Pan-African federation.
Yeah, hopefully it causes a chain reaction, you know what I mean, with other countries within Africa
Absolutely.
joining. And they're up against the most powerful imperialist forces in the world, and there's so much propaganda levied towards Traoré right now. I mean, I just saw the other day, like a week ago, BBC published an article claiming that Traoré had slaughtered 100 civilians within Burkina Faso. And I mean, and US politicians too, the defense secretaries, are doing everything they can to slander his name. And to the eyes of Westerners who don't know, who won't be able to talk to people like you or get like a different perspective from the rest of the world. So can you just kind of talk a little bit more about the powers that you all are up against?
Yeah, that's a super important question. I mean, there's a major propaganda war happening against Burkina Faso, but also the entire alliance of Sahel states, Somalia and Niger as well, and it's dangerous. And to be honest, it's pretty scary. There are all sorts of accusations against Burkina Faso's government and Burkina Faso's military, and it's just, I really can't emphasize how like far the contrast is, basically, in terms of what you can read in some of these media outlets and how things are actually on the ground in Burkina Faso. Like it's like night and day. I mean, there's a lot I have to say here. First of all, like Burkina Faso, like Mali and Niger, these are countries at war. That's a real thing. And I think sometimes it's depicted, and I think a lot of conflicts and wars in Africa are depicted in this very like, they're never contextualized, and there's this almost maybe like racist portrayal of how African wars are represented. Like it's just Africans fighting each other. Sometimes it's like
Yeah.
depicted as like random killings, tribal nonsense is kind of how.
Warlords.
Exactly. I think we should think about the wars in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, kind of like how we think of like the Contras in Nicaragua, or I know like El Salvador and Guatemala, they had like U.S. backed death squads that targeted them in the 1980s. I think we should think of the wars in the Sahel like that. These are not just like random fighting for no reason. And they're not religious also, because there's this like, I understand there's like a religious angle, but nobody around here, around me at least, like believes genuinely that there's like a religious basis to these wars. It's a sort of pretext. Really, there is an effort to destabilize this region, and there's so much context to give. But like I said, Mali was the first one to come out and say outwardly that France was arming and providing intelligence to terrorist organizations that they claim to be fighting against. Another major one is Ukraine. Two Ukrainian officials actually came forward after a terrorist attack killed Malian soldiers. Like, there was a mass slaughtering of Mali's armed forces on the part of terrorist organizations. Two Ukrainian officials came forward. One of them was a spokesperson of Ukraine's sort of defense ministry. He stated on national television basically that they supported the victory against Russia in Mali, which is basically meaning to say that they supported the Malian soldiers that got slaughtered there. And then, right after that happened, within a week, another Ukrainian official, this one was the Ukraine's ambassador to Senegal, posted on his Facebook page a celebration basically of the terrorist basically triumph over Mali's army. So publicly proclaiming that he was supporting these terrorist attacks. And so he was summoned in Senegal for questioning at the time. But yeah, since that, there's just been a very heightened awareness of the role of imperialist powers supporting these terrorist organizations. More recently, there's a lot of questions around the United States' involvement. With especially some of the hearings happening around USAID, people here did hear about there was a U.S. congressman who stated that there was potential USAID funding of Boko Haram. This is like, people hear that, it's like that's huge. I mean, in this region, this is a huge deal. I mean, this is like, it's been decades and decades of fighting it, and it's like it was portrayed as like this abstract random thing, and now there's kind of more clarity around the fact that it's not what it appeared to be. There's something called in French it's called like blanchir l'argent. So basically the idea is that NGOs, and it's a crazy thing to me. So there's been a kind of a crackdown on Western NGOs also within the Alliance of Sahel states. A lot of NGOs are able to get into like red zone territories that even the governments of these countries can't get into, because these are seized territories under the control of these violent paramilitary death squads, basically. But somehow NGOs have been able to get into these territories, and part of their like humanitarian efforts for a long time has been just kind of a random distribution of cash in these areas. And so like they kind of just spread money. They kind of in and kind of just like spread money all over the place. Well, where does this money go? Like, where does it end up? So there's been a lot of questions in terms of like who is arming these terrorist groups. But one of the arguments that I hear is that if these groups are Western backed, and I believe, especially with what Mali has said about France, what the Ukrainian ambassadors have said themselves, and officials have said themselves, there's kind of a pretext in terms of like France claiming to fight terrorism and then using that as a way to militarily occupy the zone indefinitely. And just like one more thing I'll say about this is a lot of the fighting in the Sahel began because of the NATO intervention in Libya. So when Muammar Gaddafi was assassinated in 2011, and just for some context, Gaddafi is like really loved in the Sahel. So maybe that's shocking for people who are listening outside. I don't know what people have heard different things, but he's really a beloved figure in the Alliance of Sahel states, as a side note. But anyways, when he was assassinated in 2011, there were basically rebel groups that were able to infiltrate the Libyan government's weapon stash, because the Libyan government was overthrown. So like there was no protection in terms of like their access, like the government's weapon stash was like no longer protected. So rebel groups were able to get a hold of those weapons and bring them into the Sahel. And so really it was the NATO intervention in Libya that led to first the destabilization of Mali, which spilled into Burkina Faso, which spilled into Niger, and just kept escalating. Okay, all this to say, long story short, the fighting, there is a war happening, but the context is an imperialist context. It's imperialist sort of rooted, a conflict rooted in imperialist intervention. And when Burkina Faso is accused of massacring civilians, it's shocking, because For one, people have so much respect for the Burkinabe armed forces in the country. There's constant mobilizations all across Burkina Faso in support of President Ibrahim Traoré. There's something called the Civilian Night Watch. In the local language, they call it the Waiya. These are people that come out and to serve as the eyes and ears of the revolution. They are in every single roundabout, like basically in every single neighborhood of Ouagadougou. They come out. That's the capital city, from 9 p.m. to 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning. And they do this in all of the major cities. And I was told 2,000 villages across the country. And this is just voluntary. I mean, this is what the people just decided to do on their own volition. So it's like, okay, if there were all these civilian massacres and killings with a network that is like, or well organized all across the country, where people are coming out every single evening in thousands of cities and villages and in like neighborhoods across all the major cities, you'd think that people would be like seeing these massacres, not just, on Voice of America or France 24, but there'd be like some sort of like local, I don't know, this like there'd be some sort of way for people to understand that this is happening. But it's like we don't even see this unless it's like France 24 is telling us this just happened, or Voice of America. Otherwise, it's like there's no evidence within the country on the ground. And I'll just say, just as one last note about these accusations. So a lot of them started with Human Rights Watch, which has been targeting Burkina Faso for a couple of years now, claiming that, there's civilian massacres. I'll say that there has never been in Burkina Faso a single mobilization or protest denouncing the Burkinabe military since Traoré came to power, denouncing, human rights violations, saying that this is happening. Not one. Like, there's been no noise happening in Burkina Faso. But there has been protests against Human Rights Watch. There was a protest where Burkinabe people came out in front of the United States Embassy, and they said that, we burned down the French embassy. We will burn down the U.S. Embassy next, because we know that you are responsible for the lies being spread about these, alleged massacres happening in the country. So people are really vigilant, and they're actually protesting, Human Rights Watch, not Burkina Faso. There's a lot more I can say, but take everything with a grain of salt. We have to remember how they destabilized countries like Libya. How they manufactured consent for the Iraq war. They didn't do that on the basis of truth. So the capacity for the media to lie. I mean, I just hope that we understand that it's a media machine that's advanced, and it doesn't tell the truth. And we've been told this for generations. Malcolm X said that the journals will have us believing that the oppressed is the oppressor, and the oppressed is doing the oppressing, and the oppressor is the oppressed. And this is something President Ibrahim Traoré talks about a lot. So I'll stop there, because I know it was a long answer, but there's also just a lot that needs to be said.
No, it was a great answer. And I will say that Americans, especially Westerners in general, have been in the dark for decades and decades and decades and decades, because the media here is so crazy. And the wars that are started here, nobody even knows why they're actually started. And whatever reason the media gives, people will just, in the past, have just believed it. But I think with the advent of the internet and alternate sources of information, over the years, more and more Americans have woken up to the reality of how these institutions function. I will say that with the current administration here in the US, when they did away with USAID, a ton of Americans, I would say a majority of people who were participating in the discourse, were totally for it, because now we know what the US government has been doing with our tax dollars to fund these terrorist groups for decades and decades behind our backs. And there was no way for the American people to be aware of it unless you have access to like more niche media outlets, which back in the day most people did not. They just had whatever was on their TV or whatever was in their newspaper. So in recent years, I'm happy to say more people are waking up to the reality of what's happening in the Middle East and in Africa and in India and throughout the world, with American dollars, with the help of Europe, of course. So I'm glad that, things are really shifting globally. I think there's been a huge shift. And like you said, with the rise of multipolarity, it's been really amazing to see. I saw that Traoré went to Russia this past week for the Victory Day celebrations commemorating the victory of the Soviets against the Nazis, and I saw him lined up with so many amazing anti-imperialist politicians from China, Russia, and beyond. And that was just so absolutely amazing to see. And then here on the other end, you have leaders in Europe, like 5 of them, join up together for their sorry little meeting that they posted at the same time to be like, look, we're doing something too to unite. But no, you really see the global South uniting in a way that I've never seen in my lifetime. It's really unprecedented. Um, and I'm really, really glad to see Traoré be so involved and also protected by Russia. I saw that they gave him Russian fighter jets to travel from Africa to Russia so that he would have extra protection on his way there because there's a bounty on his head. But just that, I guess we haven't really talked about the projects that Traoré has been working on nationally within Burkina Faso. I guess we should kind of talk about how he's trying to develop the nation. Could you give us some information on that?
Yeah. I mean, there's so much happening, and it's incredible to witness everything going on. Like Thomas Sankara, Ibrahim Traoré is really, really focused on food sovereignty. I would say, like right now, the cornerstones of the revolution in Burkina Faso are food sovereignty, industrialization. Um, yeah, those are there's a third one that I'm kind of forgetting right now, but they all really go together, like food sovereignty, industrialization,
Monetary
projects.
sovereignty.
Monetary sovereignty is a big one that the AES, Alliance of Sahel States, is working on collectively. They're fighting for greater control over their resources. So Burkina Faso has began to nationalize some of its gold mines, and President Ibrahim Traoré has stated that he plans to revoke more mining licenses for foreign companies because Burkina Faso does have the capacity to use its own resources and develop its own resources. On that note, Burkina Faso inaugurated both a gold refinery and a mining waste processing plant, or like a mining waste refinery. There was an update to the mining waste refinery this year, which is that it's now functional. So maybe scraps that used to be, seen as useless, like they can actually produce gold bars in-house in Burkina Faso with this new facility.
Nice.
Yeah, so these are major projects. With support from Russia, Burkina Faso is working on building a nuclear power plant. Russia is also supporting Mali in these similar endeavors. So there's Mali has a gold refinery deal with Russia, as well as potentially 1 to 3 nuclear power plants for Mali as well. So this is really major. I'll just say, and I hate to quote the World Bank. I mean, they suck, of course, but sometimes we just don't really have other statistics to quote. But the World Bank says that in Burkina Faso, about 80% of the population doesn't have access to electricity. And based off of, I've been around the country. I do live in the capital, but I've been, all over different regions of the country, and it is pretty accurate. A lot of people don't have any access to electricity whatsoever, and so the fact that we're talking about building nuclear power plants, this is something that's going to really transform the lives of the people in a concrete way. That's a huge thing, and we can't industrialize without access to power, without access to energy. Niger, for example, is one of the world's leading exporters of uranium, and Niger's government just nationalized its uranium mines, stripping control from the French state-owned company Orano, taking power back into their own hands. So if these 3 countries are really, going to unify into this, local power, we have totally like all of the resources at hand basically that we need. I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating when I say all, but we have, a strong basis in terms of what is needed for industrialization. There is a massive, massive emphasis, like I said, on food sovereignty in Burkina Faso. So that's in the form of both supporting the agricultural sector, which is the greatest sector of the economy by far in Burkina Faso up to this point. There's this wonderful video I saw of a farmer, like, crying, like, tears of joy. He was speaking the local language, just like basically saying that, he's never had such a great yield, and he's just so grateful to President Ibrahim Traoré, who gave him so much farming equipment. But yeah, the government is really distributing, tractors. They're distributing other farming technology, plows, seeds, fertilizers, all sorts of things. These are being given free throughout the country to really, really boost local production. And that's a major, major thing. And I think one of the things that's important to note is that, and this is really what food sovereignty is about, which is that, of course, the country wants to be able to sell things and compete on the world market and all of that, but it doesn't make sense for African countries to produce basically just cash crops for external export and then import all of their staple foods. And that's been sort of the colonial sort of economic framework. So Burkina Faso consumes a lot of rice. There's a major emphasis now on growing rice, in Burkina Faso. It's incredible to see some of these changes. And, there's also a lot of local factories that are tied to, food processing, things like tomato paste factories. There's now 2 of them in the country. There's a wheat mill. There's like a dairy, what do you call it? Like a dairy factory. I think there's a better word for it in English, but yeah, basically like producing dairy locally. So there's a lot of things that are about supplying people with basically the basic things that they're consuming in that sort of trajectory. There's a big focus on having a more sovereign military and having Burkina Faso needs to have the capacity to defend itself. Any country that's attacked by imperialism really needs to be able to develop a military that's able to defend itself. And so, the AES countries really do hope and are working towards the future capacity of being able to produce basically arms that they need to not be attacked by these, death squads that are terrorizing the civilians and the people. And yeah, there is a lot of Russian support in terms of defense as well. Oh, I feel like I'm forgetting so many things, but there's just there's a lot. A lot. So hopefully I'm touching on some of the big ones, but there's a lot of other changes that have happened. So some of it might be escaping me, but yeah, there's also just a change in the national identity, moving back in towards like the Sankarist one, as people call it. So the national motto has now become the La Patrie le mort nous vaincrons again, like Sankara had it. Blaise Compaoré changed it. That's what it is once again. The school curriculum is changing. Oh, one thing that I forgot to mention. There's another thing I forgot to mention. So there's like a volunteer, like civilian turned combatant fighting force, like a people's militia called the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland. In French, the acronym is VDPs. And so they fight along the Burkina Faso military against these basically death squads that I'm talking about. But there's now a program for young people to receive both the VDP military training, but also training in basically patriotic political education, as well as construction, road work, like city infrastructure. This is a brand new program that just started last month. It's called Faso Mebo. And so they just recruited the first 450 people that are part of the program. And it's hopefully going to expand across the country. They started it in the capital, but it's really popular. And so I could definitely see it going countrywide right now. But yeah, a lot of work to change the infrastructure and to drastically improve it through the state. Oh, and another thing that I want to point out that has happened in Burkina Faso, there's been interesting land reform. So all the land in Burkina Faso was nationalized. And so it's all under state control. And in particular, urban land, there was a very interesting law that was passed. This was actually something that happened early on when Traoré came to power that I think kind of slipped under the radar a little bit, but it's super important. Basically saying that in urban areas, no entity can have more than, I think it's 5 hectares of land. I might be wrong about how many hectares it is, but limiting the amount of land that can be possessed in urban spaces. And this was basically targeting real estate companies that were buying up entire neighborhoods for speculation and profiting off of land. And a lot of times it was like, as cities expand, people who were previously kind of on the outskirts would sell family land, not really necessarily understanding the long-term implications, and then the land was getting basically gobbled up, and it really cut the power of basically these real estate giants. So there's a lot happening. I could keep going. There's like so many different changes happening, but yeah.
Awesome. It's so awesome. I saw he's also, you guys are building thousands of kilometers of roads that didn't exist before, and things like that to us in the West might seem so simple and not really a big deal, but it's a huge deal to industrialize a nation like that. And I just think it's funny. It's interesting how, in the West at least, the left, I don't think they have a grasp of how important industrialization is. That it should be really the central focus of any leftist government or movement, socialist movement. And in fact, a lot of Western leftists, uh, they fight against industrialization. Like they'll fight against the creation of nuclear power plants coming to existence in Africa, for example, especially through these Western NGOs. And in some cases, it has stopped African nations from actually building nuclear power plants, which is crazy. It's crazy to think like how much brainwashing goes on
Yeah, that is
within the
crazy.
Western left.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it's actually really fucked up. And I mean, yeah, these government programs, these NGOs are, they do their best to spread it throughout the entire world too, these anti-development ideologies. So I'm super happy to see a competent government working with competent people who understand what needs to happen and are doing so much in such a short period of time. And I hope it can just get better and better and better from here. And at the same time, I believe it was the Thomas Sankara Center. I saw they posted on Instagram the other day a post about the misinformation that's occurring around what Ibrahim Traoré is doing, like stuff that you'll see on social media. I think that's important to address as well. And the reasoning that you guys gave, I thought was really, really salient. So could you talk a little bit about the misinformation that's happening? Because I think I also fell victim to some of it as well over here.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, I cannot blame anybody for like resharing things that are being posted on social media in this way because honestly, it's kind of hard to get information about Burkina Faso in, I think, English speaking context. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I do a lot of journalism. Like I work as a journalist also for African Stream. So I do my best to report on what's actually going on in Burkina Faso, but there's really very, very few outlets beyond that that are doing this kind of reporting in English right now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what Ibrahim? So I think actually what you're saying is actually very well connected to what you were saying before in terms of like questions around development. I think it's important to maybe address the context in which from which Burkina Faso is emerging, like its neighbors as well. I think there's it's kind of unfashionable, and I understand why. Like, there's a lot of stereotyping around Africa and poverty, and there's like a hesitance, I think, from those who want to see Africa be liberated and unified and socialist and developed, to sometimes talk about the reality of poverty and underdevelopment that do exist. But I think it's important sometimes to talk about it and really contextualize it because people see it anyways. They see the images of just like Africa suffering, like we talked about the stereotypes around war, just basically like it depicted as like wastelands, just land of poverty. And I think it's really important that people understand that these are countries, and I'm talking about the Sahel in this case, like that are very, very, very underdeveloped. And they are very, very poor, but they have to be contextualized. This is not something that Africa is. This is something that was done to Africa. And
Mm-hmm.
so I say all this to say, like the two things I just kind of both of the two things you said at once. Like the countries need to be on a pathway towards industrialization. I think a lot of people in the United States can't imagine what it would be like to, go weeks, without access to electricity, but for some people, that's their lives. We're working really hard to transform certain conditions, but I don't know. I think that it's hard for people to kind of imagine some of the material challenges that exist in this part of the world compared to the U.S. I mean, people take a lot of things for granted, whereas like here, the government is trying to ensure that there are no more power outages, that we have a steady electricity supply, that there's no more cuts in water because that's a struggle here. The water cuts out a lot during the day. We don't have running water a lot of the time. These are the changes that are happening in Burkina Faso. And I think that, it's sometimes these kinds of things aren't exciting in the West, because I think just like, okay, the country has running water now is not like a huge victory, but I think we need to really understand where like we're coming from, and then the changes that are actually happening make more sense. So I've seen things that are like kind of crazy. Like I've seen things, I saw like one video that's like Burkina Faso has restaurants staffed by robots, and maybe that's not the kind of thing that people are falling for. I don't know, but like that's not quite what's happening. What's happening is that the lives of farmers and workers are being transformed. What's happening is there is industrialization that's happening to uplift the majority of the people, to make sure that there's campaigns that are going to be able to better assure people's health and safety. Even modern medicine relies a lot on industrialization and having access to like certain equipments. I mean, these are all things that are like at the heart of what Burkina Faso is currently tackling, and like I said, a reflection of basically how France has really destroyed it or reversed, the trajectory of African development through colonialism and neocolonialism. So there's things that are not quite true that are being proclaimed, but I want people to understand like Burkina Faso is making a lot of progress, given where it started, and also given how like it's just been a few years. The government is working towards a goal of making sure that all of the children will be able to receive free education. Right now, the education system, like I can say that way more children have access to education than in previous decades, because school fees were really significantly reduced. This is actually a little bit before Traoré came to power, but he did state this year that the goal is to make it, free long term. There are programs to help university students have access to computers, to laptops, at a subsidized rate. There's a lot of things happening in terms of like changing what the actual educational curriculum looks like, even if the educational system is not entirely free yet. But that is, like I said, that is a goal. There's other major changes happening. For example, there's a lot of, I saw like one that was like Burkina Faso has completely outlawed importing sort of like cheaply made like clothing from, I guess, the US, but like a lot of it is made from like sweatshops. I mean, the United States doesn't actually manufacture a lot of clothing, but I assume people mean like, like I guess the secondhand kind of. So Burkina Faso is not quite there yet, but Burkina Faso is at the point where it's working very hard to increase its local production of cotton, and not just like not just growing the cotton, but like transforming the cotton into local fabrics. There's a major emphasis to transform that sector, so that in the future, long term, maybe that could be a reality, that Burkina Faso would just not have to import anymore. And there is, the government did come out and say that it wants, to encourage schools to encourage the students to wear the local fabrics. There are sectors like like in the courthouses, for example, people are going to be wearing just like locally made cottons. Burkina Faso now has a factory to produce military uniforms in Burkina. So these are things that are happening. I just think that sometimes it's not happening 100% the same way that it's being reported. But right. Like I said, you have to understand the context of like where Burkina Faso is emerging from, and then also like it's only been like a few years, but the transformations are still very major, and they're going to have very, very long-term effects for generations to come. So the most important thing is that we're able to defend and protect the process that's begun right now, so that some of these goals, or all of these goals, actually will be achieved.
Okay, I have two claims that I would like to see if you can clear it up for me, see if I was like, I believe something that was fake or not. The first one is that I saw posts claiming that Traoré had made it so that women can give birth in Burkina Faso's hospitals for free. Is that true, or is that made up?
From my understanding, and I hope I get this right, but I believe that this has been a law since the Thomas Sankara period. I don't think that was reversed under Compaoré. I think it was one of the things that slipped through the radar that stayed from the Sankara period into the present. But there have been other things made free. Like there's one of the big ones is that people in need of kidney dialysis no longer have to pay for the procedure. So there's certain things that are being made free.
That's true.
Niger for the first time did make childbirth free though. In the past year, they made childbirth free in Niger. Yeah.
Okay, maybe the news got mixed up a little bit, but that's really great to hear because that's usually, I mean, in the US, it's a huge expense to give birth. So anytime I hear something like that, I'm like, yay. Um, and the other one is the assassination attempts. It's been reported pretty widely in the West that there have been up to 18 or 19 assassination attempts on Traore's life. Is that true? What's up with that?
Okay, so I can't confirm that there's been 18 or 19. I mean, to be fair, I can't deny that necessarily too, because I think there's
Right.
a lot of things that I might just not know. But I can only say
Mhm.
basically what the government has come forward and shared with the public as in terms of what's been confirmed. And so there's between 6 and 7. There's like one that happened. There's like two things that happened within like a span of a month that like personally I'm not clear if that was like one conspiracy like linked together or if this was two attempts. But there have been like 6 or 7 incidents now where the government has either made arrests for certain figures trying to destabilize, overthrow, or assassinate Traoré, or otherwise, carry out some sort of counter coup or something like that. Or the government has come forward explicitly and said that they have foiled a plot. This happened very recently, last month. So that was probably like the 7th attempt that the government has come forward or made arrests and
Wow.
said this. So it's happening. It is real. I mean,
Yeah, wow.
it's definitely
That's a
like a
lot.
real thing that's happening. Yeah, but the number might not be exactly what people think. But also, like I said, it very well could be because um, I don't necessarily know that like every single time it happens that we necessarily know. But here's what I'll say. I think this is
Totally.
important to note. There are local countries that are um, ha- um, basically under Western neo-colonial rule that are acting as sort of Western proxy states that target Burkina Faso and Mali and Niger. And the most notable are Cote d'Ivoire, so Ivory Coast. That's really like a major hub of Western military intervention in the region. There was speculation that the United States is working to build a new military base in Cote d'Ivoire in the north, right near the border with Burkina Faso and Mali. Um,
Oh my God.
so that's really something to keep your eye out on. There's also like the president of Ivory Coast is very, very against the alliance of Sahel states. A lot of the local media there is against it. There's Benin, so that borders Burkina Faso and Niger, and also again, Ibrahim Traoré has come forward and as well as Niger's president Abdourahmane Chani to say keep your eyes on Benin. Like we're aware of, basically like a I guess like a think tank or incubator trying like that has like foreign intelligence agencies working to destabilize us from within Benin. And then Nigeria was also at the forefront of trying to militarily invade its northern neighbor Niger in 2023, and there's a concerted effort coming from within Nigeria as well to target these countries. Ghana was kind of on this list, but Ghana recently changed its president. There was an election, and it's not as clear. Like he seems to be much more. Here's what I'll say: he seems to be much more open to having an amicable relationship with the AES than the previous leader. So but yeah, if people want to know, Ivory Coast, Benin, and Nigeria kind of are targets for these 3 revolutionary countries.
Wow. Wow. And just to touch on the misinformation again, the post that I read from the Thomas Sankara Center, they were just kind of trying to clear things up that have been widely reported on social media in the West and in English about what's happening in Burkina Faso. Like you said, some really exaggerated claims, like you mentioned the robots type thing.
Yeah.
The post said that it's important to clear these things up and try to be as accurate as possible when talking about all the successes that are occurring and developments that are occurring because Western governments who are adversarial to the Sahel states are using these exaggerated claims that are being promoted on social media to say that these governments in the Sahel states are based on lies and that Westerners should not support them or support these, warlord coup governments. And I was like, oh, that's a very, very good point. You know what I mean? That they'll use any means necessary to tarnish the reputation of you guys. You know what I mean?
Absolutely,
So thank you
yeah.
for clearing that up. That's really important to clear that up. And this has been a really amazing interview. You're such a good speaker and such an amazing educator. Like truly, this is your gift. Uh,
Oh,
and one of my final questions is that how can people in the West, how can we assist the revolutionary movements that are occurring within Africa? What can we do? I feel like we're so limited. I'm glad to have you on this podcast so I can share this information with other people. But what else can be done by us in the West?
continue to educate yourself about what's going on in the Alliance of Sahel states right now. Like I said, African Stream, which is a media company I work for, we do a lot of reporting on the Alliance of Sahel states and in Burkina Faso. So you can check out our work. Um, challenge some of the media lies or all of the media lies and propaganda targeting these countries. Do not allow the United States to manufacture consent to overthrow or destabilize these governments. There are currently U.S. sanctions on Mali. These are the first U.S. sanctions against the Alliance of Sahel States countries. So spread awareness around that and struggle against these U.S. sanctions targeting the Malian government and Malian military. I'm a member of the Thomas Sankara Center, which is a revolutionary pan-African socialist political and ideological education center. We are currently entirely grassroots funded in our day-to-day operations, and we are bringing revolutionary literature into the Sahel. We have political education sessions every single week. We work with children, young people, workers, and all sorts of people to educate people around the Thomas Sankara's ideas, but also other revolutionaries from around Africa and around the world at large. So you can support our work. You can check us out. We're on Instagram. We're Burkina Books. And then also that's our Patreon. So patreon.com/Burkina Books if you'd like to contribute to making our work possible. And yeah, just like continue to organize, basically like tell people about the Alliance of Sahel States. It's hard for me to know how much information the average person in the United States has about what's going on in Burkina Faso in general, and then also on the left. Like, I just don't really know if people know what's going on. I don't know if people are even familiar with the fact that there's a revolution happening in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. But, organize activities in your community to spread awareness. You can have workshops, you can have teach-ins, and spread this information, because it's very important that we just don't allow the Western countries and the United States in particular to convince people that it's okay to invade or overthrow what's going on.
Yeah, and share this interview with all of your family and friends too, because everybody needs to know this information, honestly. And it's been such a great condensed format overview of everything that's happened and has been going on. I think this is going to be really, really great. So please share this. I'm going to link below the social media of the Thomas Sankara Center and African Stream. That's so cool that you work for African Stream too. I did not know that when you were coming onto this interview. I love African Stream. I don't know if it was a couple years ago, they were banned on Instagram, right? You guys got banned
Yeah,
by
last
the
year.
US government.
Yeah, last year. So
Yeah. So
severely
where can we
targeted.
find your work?
So we were kicked off of Instagram, YouTube,
What the fuck? Yeah.
TikTok. Yeah, it was crazy. TikTok, Facebook, and then our Google Drive was wiped away. So like we lost access to all of our like everything we were writing and working on, all of our projects were just erased. We were wiped off of Google.
Wow.
So yeah, the U.S. State Department didn't like what we had to say. They accused us of being funded by Russia. We're not, just to put it out there. I mean, I think it's hypocritical in the first place to like care because the U.S. funds all sorts of medias, but we're not funded by Russia. But that's why that was their pretext for getting rid of us. However, we find other ways. So you can still find African stream material on Instagram through personal accounts. So the best one is Ahmed Caballo. So if you look at the Ahmed Caballo account, it's a personal account, but we do share materials from African Stream on there. We are still on Twitter or X. So the African Stream is up there. We are on Telegram. Yeah, and then on YouTube also, again, we just use a personal page, Ahmed Caballo on YouTube.
That's good to know.
The Ahmed Caballo Instagram page is kind of getting restricted now, so who knows what will happen. But at least for now, you can still go on that site or that page.
Okay, good to know. I'm going to link all of that below so people can easily find it because it can be really difficult, and African Stream is one of the best resources to get news coming out of Africa and geopolitical news. And I remember when that happened, when the ban happened, everyone was like, what the fuck? That's so fucked up. So I'm glad you guys are still keeping it going, you know what I mean? Because that was quite the blow. But the U.S. government does not like the truth to get out. So even more reason to go and follow everything that these people are doing. I'm also going to link the Patreon for the Thomas Sankara Center so people can go and support monetarily as well. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming on. And you're welcome back anytime. If you or any of your colleagues, comrades have messages that you want to share, because thousands of people are going to be listening to this, you're welcome back anytime. And I appreciate everything that you guys do so much. It's so appreciated by so many of us. So it was an honor to have you here, Inemesit. Thank you.